But I've noticed something about myself over the last few weeks. I've noticed, first of all, I get my car washed like every other week, and I go and it's to the same kid every time. He's in his mid-20s, and I go in and I always give him a really good tip. So he leaves what he's doing to come do my car, but he always goes above and beyond. He takes real good care of the tires, and I'm infatuated with the tires, so they have to be perfect. So he does that. But what I've noticed is every time I drop the car off there with him, I turn the radio off. So I'm always listening to some kind of a Christian music. But before I'll let him get in the car, I always turn the radio off. And I never really thought about that until just the last couple of weeks. Why am I turning that radio off before this kid? I have no idea where he is with God. I mean, I guess to me, he's just some kid who washes my car, but why do I feel the need to turn that radio off before he gets in there so he doesn't know that I'm listening to Christian music? Another thing that I've noticed is when I go into my office, I'm always reading a book. That's my pathway to God, is intellectual reading, learning more about God. So I'm always reading a book when I go into my office, but what I've noticed is whatever book I'm reading, I turn it face down on my desk so that my patients won't be able to see what I'm reading. And what I've always told myself is I do that because they're going to ask me, what book are you reading? Do you like it? And it's going to take a lot of time and it's going to slow my office down. But what I really have to step back and ask myself is that really the reason? And even if that is the reason, is that a good reason not to talk to somebody about God? It's because I'm too busy. I need to turn the book down because I don't have time in my office to have a God conversation. Another thing I had happen was it's been a little over a week ago, a guy came in and he told a joke about Christians. And if I'm completely honest, I wasn't really paying attention to him anyway at the time. I was just kind of thinking about getting on to the next patient. But he made a joke about Christians, and I was aware of what the joke was about, but I just kind of gave a fake laugh, right? And then just said, all right, we'll see you next week, and let it go. But after he left, I thought about it. I was like, why did I not say something? Why? Am I afraid of what he thinks about me? Or do I just want him to be a patient and pay his bill and move on? What was the reason for that? But as I thought about it, I wouldn't have let him talk about my wife that way. I know that. So why is it okay for him to talk about God that way, but not my wife? Another thing I noticed was, some of you guys know, I went camping with my wife and my extended family over Memorial Day weekend. Fake camping because we stay in hotels. But we spent the whole weekend with my family there, and I was saying I'm going to spend some time, and I want to spend some time talking with my family about where I'm at with God and where they're at with God. But I just never found that right moment, that right opportunity to talk to them about God. So we ended up going the whole weekend, and I didn't talk to my family at all about where I was with God or where they were with God. But when we got in the car to leave, I found out my wife had a 2.5-hour conversation with one of my cousins about where she was at with God. And I had to ask myself, how was it that she found time to do that and I didn't? Was it I was just afraid of what they were going to think about me? They'd think I'm some kind of a freak. I think of the verse in Matthew where Jesus says, if you disown me in front of men, I will disown you in front of the Father. I think in the past, whenever I've read that verse, I've kind of looked at it as this idea that someday somebody's going to put a gun to my head and say, do you love Jesus? If you do, I'm going to kill you, right? But I'm guessing in Lynchburg that's probably not going to happen. So I don't think that's really reflective of what it looks like in our lives. I think to disown Jesus in front of our fellow man, I think for me it's a lot more like the stories that I just described to you. And the Bible talks about this. It calls it a fear of man. Now, and where you see this is actually in Proverbs. It says a fear of man is a snare. So it's a trap. So what is that? A fear of man. For most of us, like for me, if you say fear of man, I'm like, I'm not afraid of any man. What's that? I'm not afraid of a man. What are you talking about? But that's not what it's about. It's not saying that if people in Lynchburg find out that I'm a Christ follower, that I'm afraid they're going to come and burn my house down. I don't think that's going to happen. But what it is it's a fear of disapproval of the people who are around you. It's actually seeking more the approval of the people that are around you than seeking the approval of God who put those people in your life. And the way it usually plays out is I'm far more concerned about my reputation with those people than I am about God's reputation. And if I really stop and think about it, this is probably more common in my life than I would like to admit. So that's what I would ask you guys tonight is, are there any areas in your life where you can see that you have a fear of man? Are there places that you go or people that you interact with where you act differently than you do here? Wherever you find yourself more interested in what people think about you than what they think about God. And what I want to do is I want to ask you a few questions that were helpful for me as I went through this. But do you act differently in different environments or around different people? And like I said, do you go to, let's say you have a group of people maybe at work that you hang out with, that the conversation is completely different than what you would find acceptable here. How do you interact with those people? You know, maybe it's a bar that you go to where the way that you act or the way that you behaved would not be acceptable for what you would have when you're around your Christ-following brothers. My parents used to always say to me growing up, you know, Will, you have the ability to be a chameleon. You know, you can walk into any kind of an environment, and I know Drew has the same thing. You have the ability to walk into any kind of an environment and get along with anybody. But the bad thing about being a chameleon is you might have a lot of people that like you, but eventually a chameleon starts to look exactly like his environment, whatever's around you. That's what a chameleon does. So just by being in those environments, eventually you begin to look like them, act like them, smell like them, and in a lot of ways become them. Another question would be, do you ever not confess sin because of a fear of what others may think of you? You guys ever found yourself in this situation? If I'm honest, this happens to me from time to time, and it's typically something that I would view as a small, maybe a misdemeanor sin, right? So maybe I found myself on a website that doesn't honor God, and I feel bad about it, and I repent, and I confess it to God, but I say, I'm not going to bother telling Stephen about it. And I justify it, and I'll say, you know, I'm not going to tell Stephen or Woody because I don't want to bother them with it. This is kind of trivial. I've already told God I'm sorry, you know. But from what we've learned over the last year about confession, we know that's not the way it works at all. And really, if I'm honest, the only reason that I don't want to tell them is because I don't want to lose my holy reputation, right? So that's why I wouldn't confess sins, because I don't want to lose this holy reputation that I think I've got going on. Do you ever treat people that want something from you differently than people who are offering something to you? If I think about it in my office, the way I treat people who come in to try and sell me something versus people who come in that might be a prospective patient, pretty big difference in the way that I respond to them. Let me ask you another question. Do you behave differently when you find yourself in the presence of an attractive woman? Drew. No, he was just laughing, so I threw that out there. But no, seriously, do you act differently when you find yourself in the presence of an attractive woman? If so, why? Really stop and ask yourself that question. Why do you act differently in that situation? This is a good one. Do you ever find yourself embellishing stories to make yourself look better around your friends or your coworkers or the people that are around you? Do you ever do that? Or the flip side of that is, do you ever find yourself telling little white lies so that you can avoid conflict? I can give you an example of this. This happened to me not too recently, but I came home one night and April and I had a fight, and we both said, you know, mean things to us that we hadn't acted that way in a long time. And it was like probably half an hour later we came back and we're like, whoa, where did that come from? You know, I didn't think we were capable of that anymore, and we both apologized and everything was fine. But I still told Stephen about it, just to let him know, hey, I still got this in me, you know, and I acted this way. And of course, I get home that night, and April says, you didn't tell Stephen about the fight that we had, did you? Right? I don't know if this is a fear of man or a fear of your wife. This might be